So in this week's project video, I'm going to talk about why I chose the pattern and the yarn that I did, how I adapted the pattern, because I always seem to like to do that, and then thirdly, what mistakes I made and what I really learned doing this project. Welcome back to the channel. Today I'm using a yarn I've not used before. It's a Karen Blossom Cake, and it's a color called Tide Pool. Now, on one of the many Facebook groups that I love pictures from, and I can't remember exactly who or which group posted this, but someone posted a picture of a project that they were working on using Tide Pool. And it was a very different project with a very different stitch, but I screenshot it because being new to crochet, I struggle sometimes still to understand exactly how those colors on a variegated yarn are going to pool out as I actually create a project. So is it going to give me more of a stripy effect or a pooling of colors? And again, I'm using a very different stitch for this project, but I had taken the screenshot, then the yarn went on sale, so I grabbed a bunch just so I could experiment with it and decided to try it on this particular cardigan that I was wanting to work on. And I've got a number of patterns that I'm referencing today, and with a 6.5 hook, which was sort of the main hook for one of the bodies, I did my test gauge and quickly realized it's a very drapey yarn. But my gauge was exactly the gauge of this first pattern that I'm going to reference, which was a 10 by 10 for the grit stitch. So let me talk about the top reasons I selected this pattern. The first, and I recommended this pattern in an earlier video, really clear instructions on the pattern and a helpful video tutorial. So very simple pattern to follow if you're going to make adaptations. Now, the second reason I loved her cardigan pattern was the grit stitch, which is the main body stitch. It was a new stitch for me, and I just loved the texture. She did it in a solid, and I thought it would just be more interesting in a kind of variegated pattern. And the third reason I love the habitat pattern was the really dominant rib shawl collar on the front. Just like the difference between, again, the texture that you get with the main body and then switching over to that kind of shawl collar. But let me talk about how I really adapted the pattern, because what I ended up doing was combining two of her patterns. So she also has a bobble cardigan, which overall had a very similar relaxed feel, but I just didn't like it as much. It was very dominant on bobbles, and I didn't like the double crochet background stitch that she had used. So I ended up taking the habitat grit stitch and then inserting her lines of kind of these oversized bobbles or puffs about every 6 or 7 rows. And again, she shows you how to stagger them to put those kind of two main stitch pattern ideas together. But since I was going with the bobble theme, I then added again some double crochet 5 together bobbles into the trim elements to kind of keep that bobble theme going, because it's whimsical and I just really liked it. So for me, it's not about fixing the patterns. The patterns were great. It was about personalizing it, making something I would just smile every time I put it on. So let me show you how adapting this pattern kind of made it my favorite cardigan yet. And one of the things I will point out before I talk about even some of the errors, because I made some big ones on it, is that on her bobble cardigan, I didn't do this because I love the rib look. She actually carries that bobble pattern over for about half of the shawl collar and then does the rib stitching at the end. So again, if you like her patterns and you're looking at, as I did, combining some of the ideas, that gives you a very different look where, you know, your main body is coming across much more of the front, so it's way more visible, doesn't shift to that rib shawl right away, and then you still have that lovely shawl ribbing to kind of finish off the edging on the front. So just flagging that because it's another lovely idea that is great if you're experimenting. But I promised to talk about some of the big errors, and I got a couple of tips as well. So as I was working through this project, and I'll kind of highlight some of the steps as I go through, but let me talk about errors first. I was watching the Olympics and got completely distracted. And to be upfront, the pattern talks about ribbing in front loop only for all of it. And the pattern gives you some really good tips because I'm a lefty, and she does highlight if you're left-handed or if you're right-handed. And I forgot all of that watching the Olympics, and I ended up starting and doing most of the ribbing in back loop only. So just being completely transparent, I was too lazy to frog it out after I had done like 3 or 4 rows, and I'm going to talk about why I might actually need to frog it out now that I've made some other mistakes. So all of the ribbing that you're seeing in the pictures is back loop only. But again, not a significant kind of error. I'm just being transparent. The other piece that really kind of caught me as I was going through is, again, I'm counting stitches and I thought I had the wrong number of stitches. I am alternating between, again, those double crochet big puff rows and the grit stitch. And I did have to go back to the pattern because some people count chains, some people don't count chains. And it's a lot of stitches to count if you're counting every row and driving yourself crazy. What I quickly realized is the grit stitch was new to me, and it just has a chain 1 at the end, which really can disappear. So I saved myself hours of time by just slipping in a marker every time I finished a grit stitch row, and it's just that tiny chain 1, and I wasn't forgetting it or missing it and then making all of my rows wonky. So really helpful if you're, especially new to crochet. Just add a little marker at that chain 1 at the end of the row. It starts off each row with a double crochet. You end with just a nice chain 1. And the grit stitch is an alternation using a single crochet and a double crochet in the same stitch. So it was an easy stitch to learn. Really liked, again, the texture and the finish that it was giving me. Even in this sort of variegated color pattern, I thought it was just really interesting. But trust me, you will save lots of time if you just slip a little stitch marker into that chain, and you won't drive yourself, crazy thinking and getting worried that you've got sort of something wonky going on with your stitch counts. The big mistake that I made, and it's a huge one, is, again, I talked about I'm making the shawl collar. I love the dominant of the shawl collar, but I did decide to go down a hook size, a half hook size. So the pattern hook was a 6.6. I talked about I'm using a 6.5, but my gauge was bang on. And then I thought, because I didn't really like the looser look of the ribbing in her pattern, I would go down to a 6 hook to do the ribbing. And I did, for some reason, not think it entirely through. So I did know I was going to make more rows. So again, I'm also playing around with adding bobbles, and I decided to stagger, different tighter bobbles to kind of look nice with the tighter ribbing. And I never thought through, again, maybe it was the Olympic excitement, that I needed to compensate as well on the length, because I'm, of course, changing my gauge dramatically from probably what her ribbing gauge would have been. So I did the entire sweater, wasn't really thinking, because you'll see when you lay it down flat, it did finally, twig that something was wonky here. But again, I was watching the Olympics and cheering and just kind of knitting rows back and forth while it was sitting in my lap, didn't kind of twig early enough for me to catch the errors. So I have a beautiful shawl collar with lots of really cute bubbles on the front. And when I try it on, because she has added that back panel across the bottom and I have made a tighter shawl collar, the shawl collar now does not meet at the back longer length. So as I tried my sweater on, I've got a lovely look. If you see me from the front, it looks like a great shawl collar, and then if you see me from the back, there's this big bunch of fabric from the original shrug that really just bunches up at the back, and it doesn't hang as the original pattern did for this much longer sweater. So I'm pondering through two ways of potentially fixing it. I can remove off that back panel and bring up the back of the sweater, make it shorter, and kind of cut it off if I like the length. But I did like the idea of a longer sweater for cozy winter kind of weather. And so probably going to frog out this entire collar. This collar took up almost one entire bundle of yarn. So it was a lot of yarn, but I think I'm gonna actually frog it out. So stay tuned in my next video. I'm gonna wear it for a few days and ponder, and I'll let you know what's happening in the next video. But that was the huge error. So if you do like me, change the shawl up, do a tighter, again, just compensate not only on the width, which I did, so I did more rows, but compensate by making sure that you're bringing it down to the length of the back panel as well. So with that tighter kind of ribbing, again, I was down a half hook size just to kind of make it a little bit more refined, a little tighter than the looser one that you see in the pattern pictures. It ended up being 9 inches in width. I didn't find the width for the trim options in the pattern, but again, it would now need to be longer. And again, quite a bit. I'll show you a hanging picture as well as we go along, so you can see it doesn't really show quite as dramatic when I have it laid out flat as when I'm wearing it or if I hang it up. So I love the look. I really like the tighter ribbing, and I'm going to keep that. So let's talk about how the project went as I went along. So again, because I was taking more elements out of the habitat pattern, I started chaining for the habitat size, and again, very similar kind of structures for both of these. I chained 1 row in the grit stitch, and then I immediately switched over to, again, the pattern for the puff stitch, which is a double crochet, and then alternating and spacing it out exactly as she did in that pattern as well. So I spaced the puffs the same way apart because I like the spacing on the sweater. I just didn't do as many rows because I wanted them sort of to be floating throughout the project. And even though I had bought a lot of extra yarn, so when I finished this first version, I'll use more yarn as I frog it out. I literally used almost perfectly 3 bundles of the yarn, and I still have another bundle left, so it's not a problem if I frog it out and fix the errors. So I went along again, alternating between the grit stitch, which was a single crochet, double crochet sort of pattern. So very, again, simple stitch if you're a beginner. And then just switching over to add in these puff rows, again, about every 6 or 7 inches. And originally didn't think they were that quite visible, but when you do see the funnel pattern, it doesn't show up in pictures as much as it is obvious when I'm putting the sweater on. And again, she's doing a very exaggerated kind of puff stitch or bobble stitch because she's using 2 stitches side by side to do it, and it really does create a big visible puff. And the only thing, if you're new to crocheting, to make sure you're always choosing the rows where you're working on the wrong side, because the puffs puff out bigger on the right side when you do that. So again, alternate as you think interesting. And again, I'm doing about 6 or 7 rows when I was playing around with it. So again, really easy pattern, because one of the reasons I chose it was you're making this just large, interesting shrug, and then, sewing the sides together to make the armholes. Again, I'm following exactly the pattern layout for the habitat, and then just varying, again, as I think about adding the shawl collar, making some embellishments on it just to, again, keep that sort of puff theme going. And I staggered the puff on the collar because I had staggered the puff on the main body. So again, played around with a couple of different options. The spacing on them isn't theoretically the same spacing that I have on the puffs on the back, but when I looked at how many additional rows I did have to do, because for some reason, again, I thought width, not length on the adaptation, I kind of guesstimated that I could get 3 puffs in. You could certainly get a 4th one in if you started a puff right at the beginning row. So if you wanted a puff sort of right at the start, of the shawl collar, you could probably easily space 4 rows of staggered puffs in. I kind of like odd numbers, 3s and 5s, so I ended up doing 3 for my kind of pattern embellishment or adaptation. And again, these puffs are smaller than her grand puffs. I just did 5 double crochets combined together, so that means you have 5 double crochets plus your previous stitch on your hook, and I double crocheted those together to make a little bit of a tighter puff, again thinking it matched the sort of tighter ribbing that I had chosen to do on the adaptation. If you were staying with a much looser ribbing in the pattern and a much bigger hook, you could probably easily again just insert those larger cross puff stitches to carry that theme exactly across. Or again, in the puff pattern, it was not all ribbing on the front, it's a combination of the big puff stitches across your front and the ribbing to finish off the collar as well. So those were the sort of adaptations, and again, I really liked the finished look, so even if I frog this out, I will just go back and do a longer shawl collar at the front that is going to match the length by giving me some more stitches at the back, so I don't have a shorter back that isn't lining up with the front. Again, very simple pattern to follow, and she's carrying that ribbing through on the sleeves. Again, it was the sort of openness of the rib stitching on the sleeves that I also didn't like. I'm often wearing layers, and I didn't want the stuff I was wearing underneath to show through. So I did do exactly as she did, the length of 32 to chain and 30 on the sleeve extension here for the rib kind of bottom half of your sleeve. Because the sweater is so slouchy, I thought that was important, and I often, end up getting annoyed and sort of pushing up kind of sweater sleeves. So I liked the idea again of having this long lower arm in ribbing that, I wasn't dripping my cardigan into different things or getting annoyed and sort of pushing it up. Makes it also, even though by doing the full length, easy for me to want to fold up the bottom of the cuff. So, if I was getting my hands into paint or washing my hands, I like the idea that I could actually fold up this cuff, which is, as I was thinking about putting baubles on here as well, didn't carry that sort of staggered bauble theme through exactly on the cuffs, because again, that was going to limit whether or not I could actually roll up the cuff or fold up the cuff if I wanted to shorten it if I was working on something. So instead what I did was stagger the baubles around the join. And again, because for some reason on the original pattern I didn't like that transition visually, I don't know why, on it, I thought, well, if I add some bauble stitches, I staggered them, so doing a bauble after I did 1 stitch, doing a bauble after I did 2 stitches, just to give it some interest and not have them in a straight line. Also spaced them out nicely, kind of defined the baubles nicely. I did that on both arms as well, but found it pretty straightforward. Again, the pattern does warn you, to be careful about the width here, because you need to match this kind of ribbing to whatever size of the armhole opening, whatever size of sweater shrug main body that you had made. But very easily, again, with this kind of construction, that you could do some really interesting, fun things by putting these 2 pieces together as well. So I found, again, the pattern so easy to follow, the instructions easy on the written pattern, and then the wonderful kind of video that she has to combine with that as well. So I do recommend it. Again, it was one of my 2026 kind of top pattern ideas to think about. So when I finished these arms, I had forgotten to just take a shot for you before I started sewing them up and seaming them, but I did end up with a 9-inch size. If I measure sort of the folded arm here, it's about 9 inches across. I have worn this sweater for a couple of days, just again as I'm trying to decide what changes and fixes I want to make to it. And my yarn that I have chosen is, again, a yarn that drapes really well and is very kind of soft and flexible. So that was appealing for me for the cardigan, but I have already noticed that the arms have stretched. And so again, with that relaxed yarn that drapes a lot, it is going to give a little bit as well, which is why I decided to wear the sweater for a bit before I make any changes, to just sort of let me figure it out. So I am really happy with the yarn. I'm loving the feel of it. I am very happy with the end result as far as the overall pattern. Still love the elements that attracted to me that pattern in the first place. So a lot of times I get very excited about looking at a particular pattern, and then I make the entire piece, and then it's kind of when it's finished, I'm not loving it, and I end up donating it out. This is definitely a cardigan that I have changed. I do have some fixes to it, but I think it's going to be one of my favorite cardigans as I go. I can put this into my closet and take out a very boring cardigan out and replace it with this. So I chose it because I like the aesthetic. I was curious about trying out a grit stitch, and I thought, because I haven't made a cardigan before, it would be an interesting challenge. Again, I was pushing my skills a little bit as I do the adaptations and distracted, didn't really think through that needle hook change as far as size implications. So that is definitely a lesson learned for me. But again, I like to experiment. I'm not looking for perfection. So I'm really happy that the design worked out. And I'm even happy once I frog it out and, kind of finish it off perfectly. So I think it turned into some intentional design elements. I still love baubles. They make me smile. I now understand more about some of the construction when I'm doing crochet, and I am sort of following patterns that I fall in love with, but I'm feeling more confident about not having to blindly follow them. And so if you're like me and you kind of get a pattern, but you want to sort of change it slightly, this might be inspiring, I hope, to get you to try, and you'll learn from some of the mistakes that I made. Thanks again for all your likes. We do thank everybody who's subscribing to the channel because, of course, all the proceeds are going off to charity, whether that's from pattern sales or anything else that we're doing. And do stay tuned next week. I will talk in my next video a little bit about how I ended up fixing my mistakes. And there is also one thing I've already noticed that I need to fix with a trick my grandmother taught me. So I'll show you in our next video as well. Thanks for watching.